Okay, that's
All right.
good. So we've got Joost is, yep.
Joost.
So the session is Google, Facebook, Netflix problem and regulatory approaches. So where's Ben? Ben's over here. So Ben introduced me, when I was working with Ben up at Harvard, Tony Ottinger became one of my mentors. And Tony was insistent, and I've always been a little, idiosyncratic myself about this, and it drives some people crazy. But Tony taught me that not everything is a problem. There are a lot of issues, and some of them actually rise to be a problem. Not every question, questions are good, lots of questions, right? Not every question rises to the level of being an issue, and not every issue rises to the level of being a problem. So I don't know, right, since I didn't select the title of the session, right, which is designed to be very provocative, it starts off with the Google, Facebook, Netflix problem and the regulatory approaches to market power. Now, we've already, Moran, actually, we were talking outside at break, and he said the Netflix paradox you were trying to point out was that they don't, in your mind, fit necessarily. I mean, Netflix is not Google and Facebook, that there's different kinds of questions, or maybe even issues, but maybe not a problem. So in any case, we'll start off. So please.
So it's always exciting to be in between people and happy hour. So I will keep it very brief because, in fact, I think my colleague has prepared much better thing to say, but also has a more eloquent way of saying it. The way I see this tends to be, and I'll play sort of the industry advocate, if you will, for a moment, sort of to take a consumer approach, right, and say, okay, in a reasonable world where people want access to information and people want access to entertainment and so on, what are some of the things that are currently happening in the media landscape, including the digital, the internet side of it, that are preventing them or are affording them new aspects of democratic debate, entertainment, and so on. I feel that there's, as I mentioned earlier today, there tends to be this sense of, well, the internet's going to solve this problem. I think over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen in a variety of different aspects of the industry that may not actually just happen by itself. But I'll start with sort of a forward-looking approach. Media, as it evolves, as it changes over time, tends to have this way of first categorizing and making an inventory out of existing content before it finds its own form, by which I really mean that sort of Gutenberg type of mechanic, right? As manuscript print became less and less relevant and people started printing things, the first thing they did was all the books they knew and had in libraries that were only passable by copying them by hand, and now everybody could get access to all this information. And of course, initially, because the clergy were the ones that had, the sort of access to Latin and were really the ones that are the most literate, most of the content of the early printing press was religious in nature. Slowly that became this sort of Benedict Anderson type conversation about language and identity and all this sort of cultural stuff. But ultimately I think, the power of something like reading and literacy didn't really show until like decades, if not centuries, after the invention of the printing press. So when we then sort of take that McLuhan-esque metaphor and transport it into today, when you look at something like a Google or a Facebook, I think we are just getting started with this conversation. I think in many ways, kind of to follow off on Robert's point, is this really a problem just yet? And I think we haven't really initially walked around the building at least one time to take stock of the thing that it can do at large. And so from a consumer, and I'll tell you sort of the consumer as well as the sort of industry take on this. From a consumer perspective, it's great. Everything is a buffet now, right? I have access to all this content, whether that's through pirated content, whether I can go online and use my BitTorrent. There's all these different ways that an average consumer can get access to things. So in that sense, it resolves a market inefficiency. If you look at consumer markets like Russia or any of the BRICS, what's been hurting them in terms of, access to content information, whether that's a dictatorial regime or just a market inefficiency. In many ways, the internet resolves those issues, right? People now have access to these things. External or foreign publishers now have actual sustainability in these markets that they didn't have before, for all these different reasons, whether that's bringing in devices that work well with the type of content or the consumer base there, or whether it's just the digital content or the content digitally distributed. So I think from a consumer perspective, there's a huge amount of volume to consume initially and to sort of go through and figure out what it is that we want to do with this. So it's very difficult for me to, at this point, really see sort of a connection between the internet happened and then all this content came around, and that changed fundamentally how we talk about society and how we see democracy and so on. So from that perspective, I think we're just getting started. From an industry perspective, the thing, and I will refer constantly to my own industry because I know that best, right, the games industry. What's different now is just the underlying business model. We now have things like free-to-play, which never existed before, right? It used to be you build something in the games industry, and the same applies to Hollywood and the music industry for that matter, and you spend a lot of money producing this amazing content, and then spend another amount roughly the same size marketing the thing and paying off all the distributors and so on, until finally at this sort of climax of marketing effort you end up making an amazing hit and this amazing sale, right? So that's the box office hit, and that's these are the breakout summer hits in the music industry and also in the games industry. So in that sense, I think publishing content has changed dramatically, because nowadays what you can do is you can start with sort of this piece of software, if you will, that's in permanent beta, and that people can release and then see how audiences respond to it. And as you go, collect information about this thing that you've put out, and that allows you to then tweak it to their needs. And so that type of flow of information is very different, right? So I'm talking about information not as a product, but as information as a service. And so dramatically so, in my mind, has the landscape changed. And so what that means for society at large, or for democratic debate, or just plain old entertainment consumption, I think is a very, very early stage that we're confronting. And for that reason, I'm thinking that Google, Facebook, and Netflix, I'm not the biggest fan of all of those. I don't need to know what my 12-year-old nephew is doing with his spare time. I'm sure it's fascinating, but there's sort of this overload of information. At the same time, Netflix has a vast inventory in that sense of content that I've never experienced before, and having that accessible at a subscription fee rather than having to go to Blockbuster and renting one thing at a time for $5 at a time. I can see the model there. I think that that's a very feasible way of doing it. And then finally, of course, Google, as a content provider, as a research provider, of course, Google is sort of the bane of my existence as well as it is my customer, is that, they will publish it any chance they get, and it will show up for free. So I can see how there is sort of, edges to all of this, but at the same time, that might just be sort of an early resistance to something that's much, much larger than the content providers or the political regimes or the consumer side. We have to work this out. And so I'm very curious to see what the regulatory environment there would be. I think today we've discussed sort of a range from dictatorial states to more open market policies to government-owned, democratic kind of approach, none of which really satisfy in giving an answer to this sort of digital question, right? If it is a question at all, for that matter. And I think initially what we should do is, from a regulatory perspective, not exclusively look for the answer in just the sheer economics. I think that there's a lot of innovation. And again, I'll refer back to how this monetizes, how this distributes, and so on. And so we haven't really quite seen yet what it does. I think that there might be already some darker sides to that, in that it can be wildly, opportunistic. That's in the way that some companies actually monetize their audiences, right? They take your data and they do that to optimize the content, but at the same time sell it out from underneath you, and that there's a lot of transparency issues in that regard. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, what is it exactly that the problem is with that? It's like, to some degree, there has to be, in the same way a baker knows exactly how many people have diabetes in its community, so therefore they should have this many pastries that are sugar-free. So there is sort of a logic that I think really works well from a market perspective or from a democratic perspective, but we're putting a lot of these things on top of these companies that haven't really figured out yet exactly what their servers are. And so with regards to a regulatory approach, I would say, let's keep an eye open on seeing this work out, not just from an individual perspective or from a company perspective, but kind of try to figure out all of our interests in that regard. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Moran, because I saw your notes, and they look really impressive, so I'm really interested to hear you talk. Let's hear it.
Do you have slides? Do you have slides again? No. Oh, so, yeah, if we don't have slides, we can.
I'll sit here.
Yeah, well, the previous panel talked about the problem itself. Now, I do want to set aside the issue of Netflix. The point I was trying to make in the previous session was that if there is a problem there, it's a different problem than the problem of Google and Facebook and other intermediaries. Netflix is not an internet intermediary, and in that sense, it does not exert control or potential control over other speech. So the problem that I identify is not similar with, is not the same with regard to Netflix. Now, I think that the previous panels have convincingly established that the internet is formulating into a vertically integrated, highly concentrated distribution system, in which a small number of players practically govern online life in the, let's say, in the chain of intermediaries between user speech and the audience. I think that the problem is sometimes enhanced by the fact that government is increasingly exerting what once was considered traditional governmental power through the private intermediaries of the network, as was demonstrated, for example, in the case of WikiLeaks. There is what Professor Niva Elkin-Cohen and Michael Birenha called the invisible handshake between state and private actors that enables the censoring of unwanted speech while evading judicial scrutiny, because the actual interference is done by private entities. Now, the research in which we have been engaged here in the last few years utilizes economic tools and the language of economics in order to identify the problem. But I think it is important to understand that as a basis for regulatory policy, the economic narrative is useful, but is not enough in and of itself. It's too narrow. The example I want to give in this respect is the debate over network neutrality, because this is an aspect of policy that in which content analysis has been applied to congressional public hearings in order to identify the type of arguments utilized by different stakeholders in the debate over net neutrality rules. What we now call the Google problem or the Facebook problem, I think it's a more recent identification that mainly comes from Europe. It's an European influence that sets the notion that the challenges facing internet policy may be more complex and diverse than we may have thought until a few years ago. So the content analysis of the net neutrality debate shows that the debate over net neutrality focuses almost exclusively on arguments from economic theory and innovation policy. Proponents of net neutrality, including Google. Sorry?
People have been talking about free speech all the time.
That's true, but the actual content analysis, I also written about it, but the content analysis of congressional hearings.
People who get to go to congressional hearings are not representative of the people who are fighting for net neutrality, in addition to which, even if they were, they try to...
David, let him finish. We have a discussion session if we have time. So.
Yeah.
I think that only demonstrates the problem, because at the end of the day, the people that need to decide on these things may be more susceptible to influence from people that invoke economic theory and innovation policy, and not others. So, according to this type of content analysis, proponents tend to invoke mostly innovation, while opponents of net neutrality tend to invoke mostly considerations of wealth and welfare. And in order to understand how narrow the boundaries of the debate really are, it is important to know that both proponents and opponents actually rely on economic theory, whether it is economics of innovation or more classical welfare economics. Consequently, when a question such as what network management practices are legitimate is raised, the range of possible answers is limited to the realm of economics from the beginning. And this tendency is evident not only in policy discussions, but also in much academic analysis. Again, not exclusively, but in much academic analysis. Now, generally speaking, the framing of the debate over net neutrality as an issue of economics and innovation serves opponents of net neutrality more than it serves its proponents, I think. Not because supporters of net neutrality don't have good economic arguments, but because framing the debate in this way tilts the debate towards where opponents are relatively strong. Because, for example, several scholars have shown that net neutrality, at least in some cases, is not economically efficient. And opponents of net neutrality see this as a proof of the fallacy of net neutrality. It shouldn't be maintained because it's not efficient. This point of view, in my eyes, is mistaken because from the fact that net neutrality may generate economic inefficiency does not follow that it needs to be discussed in economic terms. The question we need to ask ourselves in this respect is why, in the first place, must net neutrality be justified in economic terms? An alternative way to conceptualize net neutrality, and now I get to the issue of free speech, for example, which is one manifestation of this idea, and internet policy more generally, is to see it as a statement about the proper distribution of freedom and power in the digital ecosystem. And I define freedom for this purpose following Yochai Benkler as the extent to which individuals or other entities in a given network can influence their own behaviors, configurations, or outcomes, exercise freedom, that's the capacity side of freedom, and be immune to the efforts of others in the network to constrain them, be subject to their power. That's the liberty side of freedom. So conceptions such as net neutrality or search neutrality or regulation of Facebook end user agreements and so on are potential tools of policy through which we may protect and promote users' freedom, particularly their immunity to the efforts of others in the network to constrain them. This view of internet policy also carries another important insight, which economic theories usually fail to incorporate because they are interested in maximizing the aggregate sum of something. They are aggregative, whether it's welfare or utility and so on. And this is the notion that internet policy aimed at enhancing users' freedom carries value for each user, apart from the overall social benefits which any particular policy may or may not produce. Now, as for the relationship between freedom and innovation, I think for the sake of clarity, it's important for me to know that a regulatory approach aimed at protecting and promoting users' freedom is not an approach aimed at enhancing innovation. It's not the same thing. And I mention this because scholarship on internet policy too often treats innovation as having an inherent value and too easily ties innovation with freedom and well-being. And I think this is wrong for at least two reasons. First, the idea that stimulating innovation necessarily fosters freedom and justice represents a romantic view of technology, which dominates economic theory and popular politics, but I think most contemporary philosophers of technology would totally reject this idea. Whether an improvement in the conditions for innovation actually improves the conditions for freedom and well-being depends on the broader legal and sociocultural context in which innovation takes place. When British scientists deciphered the Nazi Enigma code, their innovation clearly contributed to the promotion of freedom. When the Chinese government cracks Skype's encryption, on the other hand, it does so with a clear intention to limit human freedoms. So it would be incorrect to generally say that innovation is good without any reservation or qualification. Whether it is good or not depends on our pre-existing normative position regarding what kind of innovation we as a society wish to encourage and what kind of innovation threatens other things we have reason to value. Secondly, and this is, I think, the main point, innovation is important in its own sake, but from the point of view of the individual blogger, the individual user of Skype, the individual user of Twitter, and so on, a policy aimed at protecting individual freedom carries importance regardless of whether such users ever create or intend to create anything new or innovative. And as an example I like to give in this respect comes from Israel, in the city of Ramat Gan. It's a city near Tel Aviv. A few mailmen refused to deliver materials distributed by a group of Jehovah's Witnesses. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these mailmen were ordered and forced to deliver the material. And these ma This is net neutrality as it manifests in old-fashioned, non-innovative in any way whatsoever regular mail. And its rationales are not common carriage, are not limited to new technologies. The new technology requires to deal with them in a new context. So what are the practical implications to internet policy? I've given this issue a lot of thought in recent years, and my conclusion has been that we need to conceptualize and specify a Bill of Rights for internet users. Now, when I speak about a Bill of Rights, the immediate thing people think about, especially in the United States, is a constitutional Bill of Rights. A constitutional right is a very powerful way to defend the right. But when I speak about a Bill of Rights, I speak about it in the ethical sense of the term. Okay, and there may be different ways to protect and promote this kind of right. One of them can be a constitutional right. Others can be governmental policies, governmental infrastructures, other types of discussions between stakeholders, as we discussed earlier, in order to come to some sort of a common practice that would be acceptable both to users and to intermediaries. But the notion is that a fundamental consideration in thinking about internet policy should take into account users' freedoms, users' rights, particularly freedom of expression. Now, several European countries have started using the language of rights, for example, in specifying a legal right for access to the internet, or in coming up with policies to bridge the digital gap. And I think that this idea should be extended to the platform itself. When you think about internet access, we shouldn't think only about the access part of this term, but also the internet part of this term. What do we mean when we say internet? What kind of internet do we want to have? And extended to the platform means to regulate the relationship between users and those who are in a position to exert power and control over them. Broadband service providers, Google, Facebook, this kind of powerful entities.
We'll wrap up.
Yeah, just one. So in the 20th century, and I think I mentioned it before in the previous session, the state was the major, if not the only, regulator of speech. Advocates of media access rights concentrated on explaining why limiting the freedom of speech of the powerful few was essential for democracy. But the structure of the information economy was such that the few powerful speakers rarely had direct control over the speech of others. This situation has changed dramatically, with several powerful private entities now possessing the unprecedented power to regulate other speech. So in many respects, this power exceeds that of the state. In my discussion with Robert during break, I mentioned the fact that I think it was Marvin Amori that said that Facebook legal counsel today need on a daily basis to make decisions about others' freedom of speech that the U.S. Supreme Court will not make in a decade. And as I think it was from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So
Doesn't he work for Netflix now?
what? Yeah, everybody works for them. So I think at the end of the day, when we have this type of entities that have this kind of power, then they should also have some sort of an obligation towards those that are subject to that power.
So why don't we take a few minutes? Was you referring to Spider-Man or Marvin working for? Marvin's working for Netflix now?
So one of those lawyers.
Isn't it Charter? I thought he was special advisor at Charter.
Charter, yeah.
Marvin is?
Marvin,
Okay.
So he was gonna.
Okay, so why don't you sort of have some, there are a couple of things, but Ben, you wanted to say something, and then David, why don't we before we respond, get a couple of interventions, and then we can respond together. So,
Okay, yeah, I
I have just a general.
Do you want to come up so that you can actually do it this way? Yeah, just so that.
It goes on the record, yeah. Yeah, so I just wanted to say, I think the introduction and both those talks were very interesting. In particular, Moran, I'd like to see a copy of your paper at some point, just so I could think about it a little more, because there's... yeah, so maybe if we could get on the mailing list. On the one hand, we have, I think, a very sort of cautious and reasonable perspective that these types of things are in flux, changing constantly, technology. And I remember just a month, what was it, 2 or 3 months ago, John Chen, BlackBerry CEO, calling for app neutrality and being dismissed as a kook. And I heard, but just yesterday I saw a headline that I think Deutsche Telekom is bringing a suit against Google for favoring its own application. Deutsche Telekom against Google to be brought this fall in Europe, alleging some sort of antitrust similar to what happened with Microsoft and Internet Explorer in the 90s. So defining problems, taking a step back, I think are very important. But at the same time, you also raise this issue more in that there's a pressing need to protect users and to assess and understand potential problems as they arise in real time. And you mentioned the right to communicate. This is something that's been theorized at least since the 1970s. The Canadian Telecommission, as far as I know, was one of the earliest sort of government bodies to raise this concept of a right to communicate. And a week or two ago, Dwayne and I were at the WESIS Plus 10 national meeting in Canada. I think down the street, the big do is going on just now, where the Zero paper is being discussed with input from all the various countries. And while we did address issues such as the digital divide, I don't remember talking about the rights to communicate or individual people's right to communicate there. So I guess my question is more broadly, what's the proper forum for making these types of big decisions, identifying these problems? Is it national governments? Is it international governments? Do the institutions we have right now provide an adequate forum, or do we need to sort of think maybe bigger or differently?
Thanks. David.
Malin gave me some good ways of thinking about things, but I have a much more interesting question. I'm not an academic, so I like to make things practical in the real world. Angela Merkel has demanded that Facebook censor comments that attack the immigrants in Germany, where there is actual violence going on, but a comment like 10 million people coming from Syria and Turkey to Germany will totally change the nature of the German Republic is true, legal in the US, and might very well be one of the things that Facebook is being asked to censor. And there's an even better example, unfortunately. New York Times said that hundreds of people are in jail in Palestine right now for what they've been posting on the internet. That shocked me, it was buried in the article. And apparently, much of what they're posting is symbolic and not substance. That they put up a picture of a martyr, and that's telling, and according to the New York Times interpretation, that's telling people we need more martyrs. And people are going to jail for things that are totally legal in the United States and freedom of speech. I could say, truly, there are millions of people who think martyr so-and-so is a great hero. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but that's the kind of thing that's apparently being censored in Israel. How do we, those are two real problems
I'm
here.
familiar with it, by the way. So.
Yeah, it was very...
Any other comments before we get comments back to the comments? First, by the way, on the reason I was late this morning was because I was at the WSIS Plus 10, I was down at the UN on that. And Canada, the Canadian intervention on the Zero draft was actually, I thought, quite good. It did talk about freedom of expression. And what was interesting is there were a number of interventions. Canada
Australia, very strong one from the European Union to take the notion of human rights out from under the section in the draft on internet governance and have human rights as separate. Cuba objected because it said that human rights was not a separate category in the original WSIS, the Tunis agenda. So it's actually, I mean, I think you're quite right to raise that in in this broader context of the discussion. But that was just sort of, so any responses to either Ben or David or anything else? Yeah, you got a mic there.
From a practical point of view, I don't think we need to come up with new rights that are not familiar, right to communicate. I'm familiar with writing on this subject, and I think much of the points that are made there are correct. But I think we have this conceptual container called freedom of speech or freedom of expression, which is basic enough and familiar enough in order to insert into it whatever normative conclusions we would like to reach. So I think there is no need in that respect to come up with new rights, new title rights. And now, who should lift the flag in this respect? Practically, I don't think that something on the international level will work, because I don't expect the Iranian government to have the same views of the U.S. government or with regard to free speech, or Israel or European countries and so on. And I do think that during the years, as the years go by, we see that national governments do have the capacity, the ability to influence, whether for bad or for good. They have the ability to censor the internet, and they also have the ability to promote useful policies. Now, I personally am not. I know that in the United States there is more suspicion towards governmental interference, and I think that it's less so, for example, in Europe. So I'm not personally against governmental interference, and I don't think that it's inherently wrong or bad. But if we don't want to go to that, if we don't want to go there, then the judicial system can have a role, and we can also have. We discussed this earlier. We can also establish forums of discussion between the different stakeholders and have some kind of mediating or arbitral kind of system in order to reach.
We got to wrap. I mean,
sorry.
So
Come to
finish your sentence.
Make your point, then we're going to stop.
We can establish different or new kinds of institutions in order to solve problems on an immediate basis that the judicial system cannot. But
So I'll give an example of what I think is fascinating, and again, it will come from the games industry. So I kind of share this practicality with you. So one of the biggest publishers in the U.S. is trying to enter the Chinese games market, and to do that, it has to go through a committee that sits there and says, okay, these things you can and these things you cannot have in your game. So, for instance, the display of skeletons is considered illegal or wrong, tasteless, if you will, and so this game now has to be remodeled and retooled, and in order to gain access, so rather, in addition to changing the actual content of the thing, the creative vision, there also is now a partnership with one of its biggest competitors, Tencent, this company that was mentioned earlier today, just to get access to this billion people strong audience. And so, in other words, I believe that there's a regulatory model for some of this, and that you say, look, certain things we do and don't want to see. In some cases, and of course, China might not be
the most liberal of examples in this, but there has to be a way where you can, as a government or as a company, control what you put out, what your citizens get exposed to. At the same time, also do this within a framework of economic prosperity and so on. And I feel Moran is very right that much of this debate has been sort of framed as, well, it's about, if we have economic prosperity, that will benefit democracy and so on. At the same time, I feel that there's an argument to be made against the, too strict of a regulatory environment, because it creates a drag, it creates an inefficiency, which, in this case of digital technologies, it's going to be very hard to ultimately control all of it. And so, you have to kind of answer, like, it's not just about the goal in and of itself, but how does regulatory play nice with the innovation and technology, as well as sort of the economic interests. And so that's the larger picture for me.
And I'll just give you my view, which is, I think we're really talking about creating new norms, right? And then the norm, how do we create the norms? How do we sort of enforce the norms? And the norms are going to be different in different cultures, but there are some fundamental norms. And I think so number one, we have an example of where we did that in a very successful way with everybody at the table, not just governments, and it was not just intergovernmental. It was the Net Mundial meeting in Brazil, 20 months ago, it was spring of 2014. And coming out of that, there were 3 or 4 countries that actually spoke up and dissented. Other than that, there was widespread consensus. I mean, there was consensus across the governments that were there, the civil society, the technical community, the academics, and the private sector. The countries that actually objected were Russia, Cuba, and India. China was silent. But there was probably the strongest articulation of freedom of expression that I've ever seen. David's cringing, and we can talk about David.
It's not the time.
Because it spoke to not just the right to hear, but the right to speak in any medium, right? And when you talk about the right of the notions of free expression, is not just about consuming, it's also about creating. And when they talked about in the language, in any medium, I thought that was actually a stronger articulation than I've seen in most other places, or almost any place else. That's just point one. So I think that there are ways to build those norms, and I think it absolutely has to be multi-stakeholder. It cannot be just purely traditional intergovernmental. What's going on, downtown. Second, you can go back 10 years into the articulation with, if you want to call it net neutrality or the open internet. And by the way, Net Mundial, they called it the open internet with a set of characteristics. At the FCC in 2005, the principles were from the consumer perspective bottom up. It was the right from any consumer to access any legal, meaning, not things like child pornography, right? Any content on the internet, access and use any application and connect their own devices and have sufficient information so that they could make informed decisions about those things. I mean, and the subsequent decade of the net neutrality debates in the U.S. has to do with the instrumentalities, the ways in which you achieve that goal because of the specific ways the law was written and taken 3 times to the courts and lost in the courts, et cetera. But those fundamental principles that were articulated in 2004 and then 2005, I think are along the lines of what you were talking about, because it's again from the bottom up perspective. So, Ellie, I think that. So I thank the panelists. Thank you for sticking around. And Ellie's going to close us out.